We are going to just discuss today IT award recommendations, and I will note that, or have you note that there are 3 different award recommendations forms that we should be using. There's one just for IFBs, there's another one for RFQs, and then there's a very long, complex one for RFPs. So I'm going to screen share. Here we go. We'll get to that right now. All right, I'm just going to show you, here's the award recommendation templates. This is awful small here, but here's an IFB one. Here's one for RFQs. That one is really short because by the time you get to an award recommendation for an RFQ, you've already justified the sole source in the approval to issue the RFQ. You pretty much have to say the agency still wants to buy what they want to buy and that the finalized RFQ has been approved by all parties and it's pretty much ready to be awarded. So RFQs are simple. IFBs are pretty simple too. We never had an award recommendation for IFBs, but I found that these agencies were somewhere in limbo. They kind of really, the RFQ award recommendation template really didn't fit it. Neither did the RFP award rec template was way too robust. So I created that. Why don't I show you the simpler ones first, and then we'll go into the details on the RFP. And I'll tell you the biggest fatal flaws that these agencies do. Okay, in the RFPs. Okay, so first let's look at the simple RFQ award recommendation. And by the way, my presentations, these are always interactive. If you have a question, interrupt me and we'll address it at that time. I like interactive training. All right, so here's an RFQ contract award recommendation. So basically they meaning the purchasing agent at the agency would fill this out. Enclosed for your review is this. And what we try to do pretty much is put in here all the data we want to collect for our PTA to award. So what you'll see all of this enclosed for your review is this. Here's the description, recommended vendor, cost, contract term, contract amount if all renewal options are exercised. Okay, I think one of the things you should always remember when you're doing these award recommendations is making sure if the agency wants you to approve the priced renewal options, they need to put that in there. I used to arbitrarily go, oh, there's a price renewal option, let me just give it to them. But in theory, the agency has to request that approval of the base year. And if there are priced renewal options, they should also be asking for those as well. And maybe we need to clarify that here. But it shouldn't be where we're just automatically giving them approval to award it at their discretion for the renewal. It has to be where they request you to approve that as well beyond the base year, and then we're granting that request. And that's how the paperwork should be. Any questions on that? I think you should know that if you have a contract and if you wanted priced, if you asked for priced renewal options like for year 2 and 3 and the vendor chose not to quote it, if it's not priced, we can't give them prior approval to award at their discretion. It always has to be a priced contract for years 2 and 3 where we do that. So there you go. Okay, so that's a simple one. And all this information should be attached and included, any kind of worksheet or whatever. And this is the RFQ. So let me just close out of there. Let's go then look at I think this is for RFP, yeah. Let's go look at the templates for IFBs. And again, I recently created this template, and the way I formatted it was so that you can easily, the contract specialist or strategic sourcing specialist, can easily just extract the data and upload certain things into your PTA to award. Okay, IFB contract award recommendations. So you have all this information in here. Enclosed for your review is the draft award rec. And remember, they're always giving us a draft because we always end up tweaking it, because we want it to be very tight for our records. So they submit a draft award recommendation, no matter what it is, IFB, RFQ, RFP, and then we'll tweak it. And the reason why we tweak it is we SITP and the attorneys here, statewide DOJ attorneys, we eat, sleep, and breathe procurements, IT procurements, protests, and everything. So we have certain ways that we want things to be displayed. If there is a protest, sometimes protests are stopped just because they start digging into our award recommendation and they see how tight it is and they drop the protest. So just keep that in mind. This is why we make such a big deal out of award recommendations, because it really gives anybody a good picture as to why we chose who we chose in the supporting documentation. Okay, so this is for an IFB. Okay, state here what, if any, changes were made to the IFB that was signed by the top vendor. In other words, like, and this stands for RFQs too. Like if I'm getting an award recommendation for an RFQ, I want to know what kind of changed, if anything, from when we approved it to issue. Like, oh, we had negotiations and they were on delays, liquidated damages, and blah, 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 blah. I always want to know, we always want to know what changed from when it was formally issued to approved to post or issue. Okay, include any BAFO details here. Yeah, and there may be some BAFOs here. You definitely need to address BAFOs in your IFBs and RFPs if they exist. Okay, here's this little template that you saw in RFQs. And then here's what I structure to, and this is, a lot of this is what I extract and put in my PTA to award. As a minimum, I put this in my PTA to award. But here they can also put, they have to put who was responsive or not. You know, you could have had 10 offers and only 5 were responsive, and which ones substantially conform to the specs. And yes. Okay, and there is typically for an IFB and eval team, because they do have to confirm that it substantially conforms to the specs, and then they look at price. So, okay, so this is it for an IFB. Super simple, right? 2 pages. Easy, and once they fill that out, it makes your life easier for completing your PTA 2 award for an IFB. So I'm going to close out of there. Okay, does anybody have questions? Who all do I have on here from DOJ Legal? I see Alicia, and is that it? Okay, I'm going to talk to you about the RFP template without comments. Know that the edition that you're actually seeing right here is a template with comments and suggestions by statewide DOJ Legal. This is a really helpful document. I wanted to consolidate all of statewide DOJ's comments to kind of give like a primer to people, so they're creating the draft award recommendation the right way, the first way out of the chute. That doesn't always happen. So I think after Lauren and Sarah and Cheryl kind of looked at these, they realized where the big mistakes were made, and they put a lot of really good comments in here about explaining things and whatnot. But I'm not going to go through this particular risk list right now of these comments because they were not consolidated yet. I really plan to do that and to make it better. Now, to make it better for the agencies to complete these easier and adding their value at the beginning and not after we tell them to. I think I have another award recommendation in here, just a plain one. All right, so now what we're going to do is I'm going to open up the statewide IT award recommendation template for RFPs. It is a long document, and it's like a term paper. And when I have preparatory meetings with the agency, I have a slide deck that any of you can present to your agencies on best practices for evaluations. My biggest suggestion that I give to these people is please don't make it like a term paper where you did all the work, or you did the evaluation and then it comes time to the end and you have to document it all. I said I want you to create the draft award recommendation as you're evaluating it, and because you get a much better document. So I said you need to appoint someone to be a scribe or an admin assistant that's going to, not an admin assistant of the eval team, that's going to document what everybody's talking about, strengths and weaknesses. So I'm going to open this up. So the biggest thing is for them to understand that this is not a project where you just finish it at the end. Oh, I got to hurry up and do this crappy old thing and whatever, because as you could see, this document here is very long. Okay. Look, here's the table of contents. We have multiple pages here. So it's not a simple document, and it's not where you want to complete it in an hour after you're all done evaluating. It's very important to us in statewide DOJ legal, and this is what you have to convey to your agencies. Okay, here's the introduction. That's, cut and dry, pretty simple. Some of it you can even, if you want, extract it. Or, I mean, you're not creating this. They're going to put a summary of what they're buying. Then they put who the evaluation committee is. And we actually have it categorized here, whether they're SMEs, project manager, or whatever. Evaluation criteria and methodology. Here's the biggest thing. Is Bill Nolan on the, I don't know if Bill Nolan's here. He and I just reviewed a draft award recommendation from Enterprise Architecture for a DMV, very complex system. And lo and behold, the agency or the people who evaluated didn't literally list the evaluation criteria exactly as it was shown in the RFP. They kind of moved things around and like morphed it to whatever they felt like they had to evaluate. So Bill and I went back and said, no, this has to be, this list here of evaluation posted, but it has to be exactly where was it listed in the RFP and what is it. So that's an important thing, is you as a contract specialist and statewide IT and a strategic sourcing specialist, you have to go back and confirm that. Now, I learned that the hard way, not me personally, but I was involved in a protest. And what happened was the agency had a superintendent, I'm probably revealing it now, and the superintendent wanted one particular vendor to win, and the eval team didn't agree with him. And the only way they could fudge it around to give the superintendent what he wanted was if they changed the eval criteria. So when we got the eval criteria in our draft award recommendation, and I was not the contract specialist, but it was just approved to go. And no one really went and compared what was in the RFP versus what they actually evaluated and fudged around with. So this has been a protest, and believe me, this is, I'm not giving you anything where I'm a whistleblower or anything. I mean, this was already blown out in the open, what had happened. So I want you to be acutely aware that, and double check that whatever they have for their eval criteria was exactly what they posted. And then they have to go through and justify all of that. Okay, evaluation of bid submission. This is very important because I think this is where we get into were they responsive or not. And I think if you ever want, I have a matrix that DHHS created, and it's they call it a responsiveness matrix. I think I'll find it here. Oh, here it is, responsiveness matrix. I actually did save it separate. Okay, if you ever would like, you can give this checklist to your agencies if they're having a hard time with or documenting or whatever. Like here's an example. I'm going to make this a little bit bigger. Okay, received offer. Is this included? What about this? Was this thing? Was the they go through the whole thing and they check to see. And they check all the boxes here, and it's a great template and great format, but that kind of helps us understand were they responsive or not. And then you could even get into how much did they substantially conform to the specs, and you could say that that's a whole different ball of wax, but this is pretty much what the purchasing agency does before they give it to the eval team, and this is called a responsiveness checklist. So I could, if anybody wants that, let me know. Okay, so there you have it. Okay, so you're supposed to list everybody who who submitted offers, and then you have to say whether were they responsive or not, and then you have to go and explain very clearly why they weren't and give examples and whatnot. Okay, non-responsive vendors, responsive vendors, give a synopsis of each proposal. Okay, and then you get responsive vendors, and then you get into the technical specs, who substantially conformed. This criteria below should be the same as the eval criteria. So if your first sentence is how well the vendor's offer compares to the RFP specifications, That's what this should say. And then the second one is how they compare. Always make sure they're evaluating just in accordance with the criteria that was in the posted in the RFP. Okay. All right. Do you want to know what the biggest, does anybody know what the biggest mistake that agencies make whenever they're filling out these strengths and weaknesses? And this is something Relita taught me years ago. Oh, there's Relita. She's here. Relita told me that they oftentimes give a strength or a weakness, but they don't explain in lay people's terms why that's a strength or a weakness. They could say, well, this vendor has a lot of experience in this sector, and that bodes well for the successful implementation. You need to say what the strength or weakness is, but then you have to say why that's a strength or weakness in relation to this particular procurement. It has to be very robust. So list your strengths and weaknesses, but also list why they're important. One time I read a weakness that said, well, this vendor only had 2 people for the support of the go live, period. Well, why is that bad? Well, just having 2 people at a very intense time of the go live is not necessarily going to set us up for success in the go live efforts, which is very, like we call it hot ops. It's very important at that time. So what you want to do is always make sure your agency states the strength or weakness, but you also want them to say why. And they may know what it is, and it may seem very obvious, but it may not seem obvious to this other vendor who lost the award, and they're going to, they're going to want to understand why that was a big strength or weakness or whatever. Okay, so that's one of the biggest mistakes I see that people make. The other mistake is they are not really addressing the strengths and weaknesses in accordance with the eval criteria. Okay. All right, so these are all the criteria and this references and key personnel. Okay. I don't know that I'm going to get into, when I see references here, it reminds me of the e-dealer contract that went through various protests up to the North Carolina Supreme Court. And I think Olga and Cheryl and Alicia, and if Lauren's on here, they all know about that. But we are really closing the lid on getting any material deficiencies that the vendor may have had. If we say that you must submit a VRAR, and if you must submit enterprise architecture diagrams, if it's a must and a requirement at offer submission, and if this vendor does not give you that, they are non-responsive. You cannot collect that data any other way because they failed to submit it. And the reason why I bring this up is, do you see the references here? DOTs in their particular procurement, they said you must supply 3 references. Okay, well, guess what? It ended up being that the top vendor that they awarded to, DOT, only provided 2. And they collected the 3rd one via a clarification, which, when you think about it, that's a material deficiency that they had because it was a requirement to submit references. Okay, so DOT still, collected that material deficiency through a clarification, and that was just a 3rd reference. That wasn't even like a security documentation or an enterprise architecture document. It was just like one stinking reference. Well, it went to the lower courts in North Carolina, and the lower courts agreed with DOT. They said, oh, we kind of knew that you meant, that references were good and were not necessarily a requirement. We're going to let you pass, and we're going to hold the award with this top vendor that only supplied 2 references with their offer. This vendor ended up, the one that lost, that was number 2 vendor, said, I'm not satisfied with that. They appealed to the higher court, which was the NC Supreme Court, if I'm recounting this properly, and Olga and Cheryl and Alicia can correct me. The Supreme Court said, no, clarifications are not meant to collect material deficiencies. Anytime you say that whatever this is should be submitted with an offer, if that person doesn't have it, you cannot evaluate them. Okay. Now, who was the person that went, oh, deathmatch, Kenneth, do you want to talk about the deathmatch, what happened with deathmatch, and tell them why that we're rebidding it again? I'll let you bring that up because I think you can explain it well. Do you mind?
No, not at all. I mean, so with deathmatch, there was some verbiage in the RFP that we sent out to the vendors and they responded to, that indicated that a VAR and all your security documents must be submitted at time of submission. A lot of the vendors, however, didn't want to air out their dirty laundry because of the sensitive classification of the information through those documents. Long story short, because none of the vendors at the time submitted that, they said they would only submit if they were awarded. It made every vendor that responded non-responsive, right? So the biggest thing that we learned from that is words matter, right? At some point, we're going to need those security specifications to award to a vendor. Long story short, ended up just canceling the RFP and reworking it to adjust the verbiage so that we would have competitive offers. There is a lot more that kind of goes into that, but there was some aspect of wording throughout the entire RFP that made every vendor non-responsive because of the way the wording was. So you have to be very careful whenever you're reading and putting out solicitations about your wording. So that's why it's really important to read everything as well.
Right. And I think what we're ultimately going to do as a result of that is when we talked to Jonathan Shaw and told him about the situation, he's like, he's like, you guys need to change your template. And that's kind of what we're doing as we go on, because now we're saying that we will need a VRAR and your SOC 2s, because in this case, deathmatch had a security number. It was like certifying people had the death certificate and whatnot, and making sure they were legally dead and whatever, and benefits could be paid. It was very important. A lot of highly restricted data. So, but what we were also finding is that we were losing the competitive edge. We were losing our competition by asking for this stuff when the offer was submitted. In a perfect world, we would love to have everybody submit the VRAR and everybody submit the TASD for the enterprise architecture. But what we found and what we're finding is no one really wants to submit that until maybe the top vendor. So we did make it a requirement that if you're the top vendor and we request this information, that we need to have it in X number of days. And, and we'll worry later about confidentiality and whatnot. So just know that for us, we're learning the hard way. Relita taught me years ago that the cornerstone of public procurement is maximizing competition. And what we found that we were doing by this, some of our procurements is we were limiting competition because when we were having these non-responsive bids come in and we're going to have to rebid, we have to change our words. So we're learning now to tweak the words. We're still getting what we need to approve an award. We're just not making them all supply that at offer submission. Okay. Yeah. In a perfect world, I do want all that with all my vendors, but it's not happening. When you have 5 bidders respond and 4 of them don't give you what you need, and the 5th one was non-responsive for some other reason, it wasn't, and you're canceling the bid and like having to rejigger the words and then repost it again. So we'll get there, but those kind of things really matter. So this term references, I guess, took us down a rabbit hole, but it was an important rabbit hole for us as contract specialists, as strategic sourcing specialists, and our statewide DOJ folks. Thank you for being here.
Andrea, you have a question?
Oh, yes, go ahead, Alicia.
It's probably more of a strategic question. So if you determine that the vendor is non-responsive, it kind of makes the whole evaluation based on strengths and weaknesses for that vendor moot, right? It's because it's like you're non-responsive. On the other hand, if that vendor then comes later and challenges the decision that they're non-responsive, it will definitely bolster the argument is like, well, you were non-responsive, but even if you were, you would still have lost. So do you see my point? It's kind of like it's helping the argument to say like it's it's inconsequential, even if I made a mistake about misreading something and determining you're non-responsive. But so far the standard process is if they're non-responsive, they're not really being discussed from strengths and weaknesses evaluation later on in this document, correct?
That is correct. So and that's why the purchasing agent goes through and does, are you responsive or not? And say there's 5 bids and only 3 are responsive. Only the responsive ones are sent to the eval team. The other 2 don't get that eval because it is kind of like a waste of time. Like we would never award it to them anyhow. So yes, it would be nice to know. I think if vendors do a public records request, the folks that were non-responsive, A, they'd find out why they were non-responsive, and B, they would also look at what their competition submitted, and they kind of indirectly could find out where their weaknesses were, probably just by looking at who actually won the award. Believe me, I've been on the receiving end as a vendor in the private sector. Thank you. So
I have
very
a question
good point.
Yes. Off of that. Why? So if we've determined, because that's the first thing we have to do, right? Whenever a solicitation comes in, determine if the vendor is responsive or non-responsive. Why would we continue to evaluate them if they're non-responsive from the get-go?
We don't evaluate them. Once we find they're non-responsive, we don't evaluate them.
But I think kind of to just, again, to strengthen our point later on, if they do challenges, to give a really good explanation why they're not responsive, and maybe even include something about the weaknesses of their response along with it, right? To just later on, if they challenge it and want us to consider them, if the argument is made. But it sounds to me like once its determination is made, it's non-responsive and it's clearly explained, then they're out of the pool of the remaining vendors for evaluating strengths and weaknesses, right?
That's correct. And we kind of, Alicia, good point. We clearly also state that once you're found non-responsive, I think it's in the RFP template that, you are not evaluated any longer. And I think that's why we also have this section in here that just says, oh, here it is, non-responsive. Why were they non-responsive? So like if you were one of those non-responsive vendors, you'd be able to go right here and say, oh, shoot, I didn't provide a VRAR or whatever. And it was mandatory. And as we all know, because of this North Carolina Supreme Court ruling, we are getting uber strict in what can be collected through a clarification. Is it a material deficiency or not? So know that, we've, like Kenneth said, words matter, and shall and should, and be very clear. I want this document at offer submission, but is it a shall or a should, or is it a must or whatever? Be very clear. And sometimes if you absolutely have to have it at offer submission, I would say vendor to supply XYZ at offer submission, period. If this document is not submitted at offer submittal, you will not be evaluated. Sometimes it has to be like that black and white. I don't know that we actually do that in our templates right now. And half the time vendors don't even understand what's a requirement versus a spec. But I don't know if Relita wants to comment on that any further. But
I do remember reading this case is that the court heavily relied on, I think it's NCDOT procurement guideline or guide. There was a manual, like a document. And so they relied on the explanations given in that document. It's on the website.
Thank you, Alicia. Yeah, and I think we all know this as procurement professionals is I mean, it's in our statute, even in the IT statute here, is you cannot collect information that is a material deficiency, that you're supposed to evaluate on. How are you supposed to evaluate if they didn't submit that? That's why we're real clear in the RFP, like, okay, the technical specs are in this section. The reference section is right here. We give them try to give them a roadmap that, hey, this is what we're going to evaluate. And if you don't supply it, that's your bad. Good questions. I like it.
Hey, Andrea, can I add on something to everything that's been said?
Please do.
This is why it's really important for us as an agency to remember, we're here to limit the state to risk, right? So that's why it's really important to read everything. I understand that other agencies are going to be pushing you and trying to get the orders through and all that stuff. But at the same time, we're procurement professionals. That doesn't mean that we have to rush through things. So remember at the end of the day that we're here to be good stewards of funding, right? And to be procurement professionals. So we got to read everything. So don't let an agency push you and stress you out and move you so fast that you're forgetting the little things, because it can come back and bite you later on.
That is true. And people expect us to do that and to catch typos and or math errors and so forth. I remember Sandra, she's not here right now, but she was working on something. I'm like, wow, I thought that would have been a slam dunk. It was an IFB and whatever. Not that I was, saying what's wrong with Sandra at all, but I would, and she's like, Andrea, I found an error in their math and no one picked it up and I'm trying to get it corrected now. So that's why it's taking a little longer. I'm like, good, love it. Because, that will come back and bite you and be confusing and you name it. So, all right, now here, go ahead.
One more question for you. Sorry about that. Andre, can you give a little bit more guideline if there is only one vendor? The response, you still go through the entire process. You still outline everything, correct?
Yes, for an RFP, and there's only one vendor, I do. I had that situation. Well, no, I had that with an IFB. I don't know that I had that situation with an RFP. Has anybody, some of the folks that have been here for a while, they do kind of have to go through that just to justify that the vendor substantially conformed to the specifications I wrote, and they still have to do their eval. And are they financially sound and whatnot? Question. Yes, Michelle. Did I answer your question, Alicia?
Yes, thank you.
Okay. All right, go ahead, Michelle.
So I think to answer Alicia's, or to another addition to Alicia's question, typically when you get one response from an RFP, and for a fact that there's multiple solicitations out there, you would email those that requested the RFP and seek a reason why, just to document that there were justifiable reasons why only one person proposed. And sometimes it's their workload is too hefty, they couldn't propose, whatever the case may be, but at least you have documentation to support one proposer.
And that's definitely a good thing for Kristen Burnett's team or any purchasing agent to find out, like, where did we go wrong that we only got one? Now, I could tell you right now, with some of the RFPs I get from DHHS, they're like 300 pages. And I would look at that and go, you know what, I don't want to spend $102,000 putting a bid together, and my return on my investment, it's just not worth it. So, but good point, Michelle, that we do have to do our due diligence to find out what's our problem, like why didn't we get it. One of the things I try to have the purchasing agents do is make sure the purchasing agent contacts the known sources of supply once an RFP is submitted and send them a link into where it's posted, so everybody's aware, because not everybody maybe locked into like the announcement thing with EP. It's very complex. I mean, you're allowed to see bids that are posted publicly, but then if you actually want to submit an offer, you have to go through this big registration. And we still, even till this day, even though this new registration system is well over a year old, we still get vendors crying that I tried to submit mine and it's not a pretty sight. So that was the only saving grace with the deathmatch one with that Kenneth was talking about, where we had to cancel and rebid. The incumbent or the person who was currently giving the services had a problem submitting their bid, and James had to say, no, we can't accept it after. And they were really upset. I mean, because they were currently providing the service to us. So in a way, it was kind of interesting that we ended up canceling that procurement, and hopefully they'll have their act together and we'll have maybe 6 bids now next time. But I don't think I gave away any critical confidential information there, but very interesting how people really have to be computer jockeys to get their bids submitted. So good point, Michelle. Thank you.
So Andrea, just to solidify that when I review it, so basically the procurement specialist would contact any potential vendors or who might have been interested but didn't proceed with the process and document why the other ones didn't bid for some various reasons, but also still go through the evaluation process, determine whether or not the vendor who actually bid it was responsive, and still go through the whole best value evaluation process and criteria in the document, correct?
Yes. Okay, and I might show you a real live one that Bill and I worked on just recently. Anyhow, here's the big deal, is the summary. What statewide DOJ wants to see, and us, is the resounding conclusion that, okay, after we went through all of this analysis, it is clear that the top vendor leaps and bounds beyond the number 2 vendor is this one, and that's because this, and this. We want this conclusive statement that really ties up the whole analysis, 11 pages in a bow of the term paper, and says why you're going to award it. Now, you're probably laughing because right now I'm thinking, okay, so here's the summary. This is the summary of the evaluation. I kind of jumped ahead, by the way. There could be finalist vendors where, well, there's the top 3 and we want to do a demo, and then you have to memorialize what happened in the demo, summarize it, and then you go and say, well, from the top 3 that we demoed, this one came out on top and we started negotiating with them. We created a BAFO. The negotiation topics were limitation of liability, this, and this. You want to, they should be putting that in there. And then go to section 8, the award recommendation and any supporting documentation. Okay, that's it. Let me get this out of here. Okay, so I don't know that supporting documentation, award recommendation. I guess this is basically where, again, we want to tie up and summarize why you're picking, who you're buying, who you're picking. It should be overtly clear, and that's it. It should be a simple statement as to why you're picking who you are, and it should be resounding and sound very definitive for anybody that's reading this. So, eval committee awards the contract following. Okay. Right, and the eval committee recommends awarding the contractor in the amount of this. Again, if there are priced options, I would expect them to ask. We would, since we are requesting SITP to approve the award at the agency's discretion of years 2 and 3, or not. The following supporting documents that reflect that are attached. Now, please be mindful, and this is a sore spot. They reference all these forms, and half the time the agency doesn't give them to us. Please make sure that you have them in your procurement file. You may even want to have a separate file folder called award recommendation and supporting documents. Okay. We want to have all of that collected. Sometimes the data is so big and everything, the agency can't send it to you via email. So sometimes it's best if they just shared their SharePoint file with you, and then you could go and extract whatever you want, vendor offers, Excel matrices, and so forth. So if you noticed, in this award recommendation, we only describe strengths and weaknesses. We do not necessarily give numbers for all these eval criteria. The agency, this change happened around 2016, 2017, where we did substantial conformity to specs versus, numbers and quantitative numbers. Agencies kind of got a little upset about that. Well, I want to do my thing with numbers. And the bottom line is if they're so insistent about doing their evaluation with numbers, that's great. Go ahead and do that in an Excel spreadsheet. I don't really need to see it, but those numbers need to be translated into strengths and weaknesses verbally. Like, why did you give them a 3 on this? I always use the car example on the evaluation, like the leather on the car. If that was an evaluation criteria, the quality of the leather, like, why would you give this one a 3 and this one an 8? Well, the 8 was a finer grain, the dye lot was deeper, it was a thicker piece of leather, it was more comfortable, and blah, 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 blah. And then the 3 was, well, it was actually cheap vinyl and whatever. So you really always have to translate any of those numbers into text and what we call a narrative. And that's what we expect, and that's why this form looks like it does. Okay. The last thing I'm going to show you is I have it on my hard drive, and I'm pretty sure I have it in SharePoint. I have this called evaluation training documents. And I have a lot of things that agencies have shown me. And then I also have a really good PowerPoint presentation that I do believe was created by Relita and Jill Barber. It's the evaluation kickoff presentation. And any of you could, after having attended this training, you could all probably give this presentation. If you have a big RFP and they're kicking off the evaluation, this is where I say I can offer this presentation to give to you. But it's to discuss the activities associated with the evaluation of offers and to make sure that you are, this actually has a name of here, but just to make sure you're following guidelines and that, you know, no one's talking. There's an NDA with anybody on the eval team. You shouldn't be talking. Talk about the guidelines and processes, next steps, pride, and so forth. Confidentiality policy. So this kind of sets the ground rules for their evaluation. That no one should have a conflict of information. You should have no communication with vendors. Here's the evaluation process and guidelines. Best value, we talk about that. Substantial conformity, we explain what that all is. We say the difference between requirements and specs. And this was just the key spec categories in this particular award. You could tweak it, or you could actually make your agency person tweak it if you'd like. What else do I have? Okay, so you talk about what you're going to do and how they could, this could all be set up. You don't have to fill this in, but evaluation goals. What else do I say? I think the biggest thing that I stress to these people, and here's definitions of strengths and weaknesses. What I stressed to these people is that please nominate a person that's going to be your scribe so that they could just document this as you're meeting as a team. And when you're all done with your evaluation, you're all done with your draft award recommendation too. I am just working on a DHHS procurement, and DHHS just asked me, we need you to hurry up and look at the errata and exceptions, and they need to be reviewed by Lauren because Lauren handles DHHS. And I said, well, where's the award recommendation? Did you give me all the vendor offers? You know, oh, we don't have the award recommendation yet. I'm like, okay, so you want us to hurry up, but yet you really didn't do your job. I said, we'll go and look at the errata and exceptions to our terms and conditions, but folks, you need to have that award recommendation done. Okay, so keep that in mind. Okay, so that's the big thing that I tell them is please work on your award recommendation. Okay, there's the timeline and a schedule, and then there's any questions. So I'm pretty sure this is in the SharePoint site. So we'll do that. Okay, I have 15 minutes. Dismiss, snooze. Okay, I think I had one last question or comment for you all. And I'm teaching you things that I've learned like the hard way. Relita could probably chime in with 12 other things. And Relita, please, is there anything I've missed? Does anybody have anything I may have missed in this whole draft award recommendation review? Here is an example of award recommendation and some typical errors that agencies make. And we'll just do this real quick. But Bill and I reviewed this. Bill did a great job of sifting through it. Let me see. I'll just go into review all markup. Oh, this is all markup. Okay. Okay. These folks, let's see, the request evaluate. Okay. This is the one where they put in eval criteria that didn't even align with what was in the RFP. They did their own little thing. Oh, here's the scope of work. Oh, I'll put references, key personnel cost. That wasn't what was in the offer. This is what was in the offer. So we're having them go back and like tighten up their review, because each one of these things, they have to address how each vendor strengths and weaknesses were for that particular criteria. So the other thing they did was there's supposed to be a timeline here. This is the timeline of the actual procurement not of the project once the procurement is awarded. So that had to be tweaked. They did fine here. So this is where Bill was kind enough to like start revising everything to say, you know, what you're going to write here, it has to be in accordance with the list in your RFP that you chose. So we went through, and I think we also said, oh, Bill didn't like that the top vendor kept saying with everything there were like no weaknesses. And we're like, is that really true? It might be a little bit more realistic, but they're looking into that too. I think here's what I wrote before. This is a good listing. However, it is important to state why these are strengths and weaknesses. Your audience has to understand clearly why these are strengths and or weaknesses so any person off the street can read and understand. And I said this edit and suggestion applies to all eval criteria. So they're going and redoing this. And by the way, Bill's doing this all while the E-approvers are reviewing, so we can do that. Oh, my last point is that with draft award recommendations, we want them to be super tight. And if you get an award recommendation that content-wise makes pretty much sense, we continue to tweak it as we're awarding it. So best practice is to do it in series. Approve the award recommendation in its entirety, which includes statewide DOJ legal. However, sometimes people are in such a rush, we are reviewing it legally and with SITP at the same time, but we try not to do that. And I know Cheryl doesn't like that at all, and I don't blame her. So, okay, cost proposal. All right, finalist vendors. Yep, they didn't have any negotiations, so they went to, there were no finalist vendors per se, there was just a top vendor, so we made them write a salient statement as to why the top vendor came out clearly on top, and we met, and there it is. So that's an example of how you can rip apart a draft award recommendation. And we don't need to rip them apart, we just want them to be substantial so we can feel good about awarding to a vendor. And that's it. Thank you, everyone.